Imagine, for just a second, weighing your brain on a scale.
Okay.
It's roughly, 3 pounds.
Yeah.
Now, if you strip away all the water, all the blood, the cerebrospinal fluid,
The structural stuff. Yeah.
right, what you were actually left with is mostly fat. I mean, the human brain is nearly 60% fat by weight.
It's incredible.
It is. But here is the really jarring statistic that completely reoriented how I view human biology.
What's that?
Nearly 100% of the structural fat holding your intelligence, your memories, your personality together, it's made of a single, highly specific molecule.
Yeah.
And it's a molecule that your body, for all its, evolutionary brilliance, is practically incapable of manufacturing on its own.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive. I'm talking directly to you listening right now because whether you are trying to outthink your competition at work or delay that cognitive decline that comes with aging or even just regulate a persistent underlying anxiety.
Right, the daily stuff.
Exactly. You are entirely reliant on this outsourced structural material.
It's literally the ultimate biological vulnerability. I mean, we possess the most complex, energy-demanding computational organ in the known universe, right?
Yep.
And its physical architecture is entirely dependent on our daily foraging habits. We have to consume the building blocks or the hardware simply breaks down.
Which is exactly our mission today. We are moving way past the wellness industry buzzwords.
Right.
You see Omega-3s slapped on egg cartons and gummy vitamins.
All the time, usually with those vague promises of brain health.
Right, exactly. Vague promises. So we are dispensing with the marketing today. We're pulling from an extensive stack of research, including some really deep dive biochemical analyses and clinical data synthesized from Gary Brecka's recent physiological breakdowns.
The hard science.
Yes, to understand the hardcore mechanical reality of how these specific lipids literally build, protect, and regulate the human mind.
And we're going to look at this through the lens of structural biology, right down to the cellular membrane. Because what becomes overwhelmingly clear when you look at the clinical data is that our most abstract human experiences, like a fleeting mood, a sharp memory, a sudden burst of focus, they're entirely predicated on the physical integrity of the fats we ingest.
Wow.
There is no separation of mind and body here. I mean, the mind is the fat.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if we're going to understand why the brain is so uniquely dependent on these specific fats, we have to look at the engineering of a neuron.
Do it.
Why are we talking about fat as hardware? What makes an omega-3 molecule structurally different from, say, the saturated fat in a ribeye steak or the monounsaturated fat in an avocado?
Well, it comes down to the subatomic architecture of the carbon chain. Let's look at the biochemical reality for a second.
Okay.
Saturated fats, they have a straight, highly rigid chemical structure.
Right.
Their carbon atoms are fully saturated with hydrogen, meaning they pack together incredibly tightly.
Right, like bricks.
Exactly. That's why a stick of butter is completely solid at room temperature. Now, if your brain cell membranes were made of saturated fat, they would be essentially frozen.
Frozen.
Yeah, they would be stiff, impenetrable walls.
And, a stiff wall in a biological system usually means death.
Absolutely. Because a neuron isn't a static brick in a wall, it's a highly dynamic processing unit. It needs to rapidly fire electrical impulses, it needs to open and close ion channels in milliseconds, and, well, it needs to physically alter its shape to forge new synapses.
Right.
To do that, the cell membrane, the outer skin of the neuron, it has to be incredibly fluid. It needs to act more like a liquid gel than a solid wall.
Enter the polyunsaturated fats.
Exactly. Omega-3s are polyunsaturated, poly meaning many, and unsaturated meaning they're actually missing hydrogen atoms along their carbon chain.
Okay.
And every place a hydrogen atom is missing, the carbon chain forms a double bond, and that double bond creates a severe physical kink, or like a bend in the molecule.
So they're bent out of shape.
Right. Because they are kinked, they can't pack tightly together. They constantly push away from each other, creating space, flexibility, and extreme fluidity within that cellular membrane.
So if we look at the specific omega-3s, what the research calls the big three.
The alphabet soup, yeah.
Right, the alphabet soup. We're looking at varying degrees of this molecular flexibility, right? The literature focuses heavily on ALA, EPA, and DHA.
It does.
So what is the functional difference between them in the context of this neural fluidity?
They are essentially different lengths of that kinked carbon chain, which completely dictates their function. So ALA, or alpha-linolenic acid, is the shortest, with 18 carbons.
Okay.
EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, has 20 carbons. But DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, is the absolute structural behemoth of the nervous system.
The heavyweight.
The absolute heavyweight champion. It has a massive 22-carbon chain with 6 highly flexible double bonds. It is the most fluid kinetic molecule in the human body.
Right.
And because of that extreme flexibility, DHA makes up roughly 97% of all the omega-3 fatty acids in your brain.
Wait, 97%?
Yeah, 97%.
That isn't just a dominant presence, that is a total structural monopoly.
It really is.
I mean, if I'm visualizing the lipid bilayer of a brain cell, this double-layered skin holding the neuron together, is it just a sea of DHA?
Well, it's a highly organized sea. DHA is concentrated specifically in the synaptic regions, the literal gaps where neurons communicate.
Okay.
Think of the receptors on a brain cell that catch neurotransmitters like serotonin or dopamine. Those receptors aren't bolted into place.
They move.
They do. They actually have to float and shift around on the surface of the cell to catch those chemical signals. DHA provides this highly liquid, flexible environment, these lipid rafts, that allow those receptors to move with blinding speed.
That's fascinating.
Right. If you replace that DHA with a rigid fat, the receptors just get stuck in the biological mud. Communication slows down, processing speed drops, and cognition ultimately suffers.
So it's kind of like, well, let's use an engine analogy. If our brain is this high-performance engine, these different omega-3s are like different grades of fuel and oil.
I like that.
ALA is maybe the crude oil, EPA is the coolant, but DHA is the premium synthetic oil that physically coats every single gear.
That's a great way to look at it.
But let me push back on that visualization for a second on behalf of the listener.
Sure.
Because if 97% of the brain's omega-3 requirement is purely DHA for structural fluidity, what is the evolutionary point of EPA and ALA? Are they just taking up space in the bloodstream? I mean, are they just along for the ride?
No, not at all. That is the critical distinction between structure and environment. DHA is the architect. It builds the physical hardware. EPA is the environmental regulator.
A coolant.
Exactly. EPA doesn't embed itself heavily into the brain's structural tissue. Instead, it circulates, acting as a profound anti-inflammatory agent. So if DHA is the premium synthetic oil coating the gears, EPA is the internal cooling system ensuring the engine doesn't overheat and melt those gears.
Oh, I see.
And ALA primarily acts as a systemic precursor. It's a raw material that your body attempts to convert into EPA and DHA, though, well, we will get into the stark mathematical reality of that conversion process later.
Right, and that structural necessity of DHA becomes terrifyingly clear when you look at the developmental data. I want to shift into how this physical hardware is actually constructed from childhood.
It's crucial.
The research emphasizes that in fetal development and early childhood, DHA isn't just a supplement. It is the rate-limiting factor for the physical construction of a mind.
It is the absolute biological bottleneck. During the 3rd trimester of pregnancy and the first 2 years of life, the human brain undergoes this massive growth spurt. It's laying down millions of neural connections every second. Every second. And to do that, the brain essentially acts as a vacuum. It aggressively pulls DHA directly from the mother's bloodstream right across the placenta to physically build those flexible cell membranes and the myelin sheaths that insulate the nerves.
And the mechanism here involves neurogenesis, which completely rewrites how we used to think about the brain. I mean, growing up, the dogma was always, don't kill your brain cells because you are born with all you'll ever have.
Right, which we now know is categorically false.
Thank goodness.
Seriously. Neurogenesis, the birth of new neurons, occurs primarily in the hippocampus, which is the brain's memory and learning center. But a progenitor stem cell doesn't just magically become a fully functioning neuron.
Right, it has to grow.
It has to grow dendrites, it has to stretch out an axon, and it has to form synaptic cones to actually connect with other cells. The physical elongation of those neural branches requires a massive, constant supply of highly fluid cell membrane material.
It needs the bricks.
It demands DHA. Without sufficient DHA, neurite outgrowth literally stalls. The brain wants to build a new pathway, but it simply lacks the raw materials.
It's amazing that the fat we eat literally becomes the physical medium through which our memories and moods travel. But this forces us to look at the societal implications.
Yeah.
If the physical branching of a neuron, the literal biological capacity to learn to regulate behavior, to process new information, if all that is rate limited by the availability of this specific marine fat during early childhood.
Which it is.
What happens when a population is systemically deficient?
Well, the clinical observations are stark. The data shows that maternal and early childhood DHA deficiency correlates directly with lower visual acuity, delayed cognitive processing speeds, and altered behavioral regulation.
Wow.
When we see children struggling with profound attention deficits or emotional dysregulation, our first societal instinct is to deploy software solutions. Behavioral therapy, modified teaching paradigms, or psychiatric intervention.
All of which are entirely necessary, of course.
No, absolutely necessary. Yeah. But if we are applying software updates to a machine where the physical hardware was never fully constructed, where the lipid rafts are too rigid for the dopamine receptors to function efficiently, well, those behavioral interventions are going to meet immense biological friction. We are asking a structurally compromised system to perform high-level executive functions.
And this structural requirement doesn't just vanish on your 18th birthday. The data on adult cognition completely mirrors this.
It does.
There's a specific analysis highlighted from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition looking at adult cognitive performance.
Oh, that's a great study.
The individuals with the highest circulating DHA levels weren't just experiencing less decline, they actually performed better on complex cognitive tests.
Because the adult brain is in a constant state of remodeling. Every time you learn a new skill or even just form a short-term memory of where you parked your car, you are physically altering the synaptic connections in your brain.
You're rebuilding.
Constantly. You are continually relying on the fluidity of those DHA-rich membranes to allow synaptic plasticity. When you test a high DHA brain, you are testing a highly optimized, physically fluid network that can transmit electrical signals with minimal resistance.
But let's look at what happens when that resistance is introduced.
Right.
If omega-3s act as the physical wiring of the brain, what happens when those wires short-circuit? Let's look at when the hardware starts to malfunction, not from a lack of structure, but from a hostile internal environment.
The inflammation.
Yes. I want to transition into the psychiatric and mood regulation data because this fundamentally changed my understanding of mental health.
It's profound.
We always conceptualize depression, anxiety, or mood swings as psychological events. They're emotional states. But the research points to a much more mechanical, physical culprit, which is neuroinflammation.
It is arguably the most significant paradigm shift in modern psychiatry. The realization that severe mood disorders are frequently the behavioral manifestation of a brain that is literally physically inflamed.
Let's break down that biology, because we all know what systemic inflammation looks like on the outside. If I sprain my ankle, it swells up, gets red, hot, and painful.
Right.
That's my immune system rushing blood and white blood cells to the injury site. But the brain is encased in a rigid skull. It doesn't swell up like an ankle.
Thank goodness.
So what does a hot, inflamed brain actually look like at the cellular level?
It involves a highly specific type of immune cell called microglia. Microglia are the resident janitors and security guards of the central nervous system.
Okay.
In a healthy brain, they have these long, beautiful branching arms that constantly survey the brain tissue, looking for metabolic waste or damaged cells to clean up.
The janitors.
Right. But when they detect a threat, which, by the way, could be triggered by chronic stress, a highly processed diet, sleep deprivation, or environmental toxins, they undergo a radical physical transformation.
What happens?
They pull in their branching arms, they become amoeba-like, and they initiate an aggressive inflammatory cascade.
So they drop the broom and pull out the biological shotgun.
Precisely. They begin secreting massive amounts of pro-inflammatory cytokines. These cytokines are chemical messengers that effectively bathe the surrounding neurons in an inflammatory acid.
Acid.
Yeah, and this acid actively degrades the production of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, and it damages the delicate receptors on the cell membranes.
So an inflamed brain doesn't register as a headache.
No.
It registers as profound emotional numbness. It registers as brain fog, chronic fatigue, or a persistent, inescapable state of anxiety. The software is glitching because the hardware is essentially on fire.
And this brings us precisely to the role of EPA. We established earlier that EPA is the biological coolant, but how does it actually cool the brain down?
Right.
It isn't just passively floating around. EPA is an active substrate that your body uses to synthesize a class of specialized pro-resolving mediators, brilliantly named resolvins and protectins.
Resolvins, as in resolving the inflammation.
Exactly. Resolvins actively bind to the receptors on those aggressive amoeba-like microglia and force them to turn off. They chemically signal the immune system that the fire is out, halting the production of those toxic cytokines and allowing the brain's environment to return to homeostasis.
It's like putting a literal fire blanket over an overheated engine. The EPA acts as the coolant, bringing the temperature down.
Exactly.
This explains the incredible data from the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry regarding major depressive disorder. They found that omega-3 supplementation, specifically heavily weighted toward EPA, was highly effective at reducing depressive symptoms.
Yes.
But specifically, and this is the crucial data point here, it was most effective in patients who had clinically elevated markers of systemic inflammation.
Which perfectly validates the mechanical pathway we just outlined. I mean, if a patient's depression is purely psychological, perhaps driven entirely by an external trauma with no underlying physiological inflammation.
The physical markers aren't there.
Right. Then the EPA might not move the needle dramatically, but if their depression is being driven or heavily exacerbated by overactive microglia destroying their serotonin receptors, well, introducing EPA is a targeted biological strike against the root cause of the disorder.
Now, we need to be clear here for the listener. I want to push this further because the clinical literature doesn't stop at generalized anxiety or mild depression. It moves into severe, structurally complex psychiatric conditions.
Right, schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
Exactly. Now, to be incredibly responsible here, these sources aren't saying a fish oil pill cures a genetic predisposition to schizophrenia. The studies refer to omega-3s explicitly as an adjunct therapy, meant to be utilized alongside rigorous psychiatric medication.
Correct.
But mechanically, how exactly does stabilizing a physical cell membrane stabilize a mood or augment the treatment of a condition characterized by severe manic episodes or psychosis?
It is all about modulating the receptor sensitivity. In bipolar disorder, for example, the transmission of signals between neurons becomes highly erratic. The receptors can become hypersensitized during a manic phase or deeply blunted during a depressive phase.
Okay.
The pharmacological treatments, like mood stabilizers or antipsychotics, they work by binding to those specific receptors to modulate their activity.
But those receptors are physically embedded in the cell membrane.
Exactly. If the cell membrane is rigid and inflamed, if it lacks DHA and is bathing in inflammatory cytokines, the receptors become physically distorted.
Oh, wow.
And the pharmacological drugs have a much harder time binding to a distorted receptor. By flooding the system with EPA to quench the microglial fire and DHA to reestablish the fluid integrity of the lipid raft, you actually restore the physical shape and functionality of the receptor.
You are effectively laying down a pristine biological track for the psychiatric medication to run on.
You are reducing the biological static in the system. The study published in Schizophrenia Research demonstrated that this adjunct approach improved cognitive function and reduced the severity of the symptoms, likely because it protected the delicate neural circuitry from the secondary damage of chronic inflammation.
So if protecting the brain from the fire of inflammation in the present is so vital, what happens if the brain is on fire for decades? What is the ash left behind?
That's the scary part.
This naturally leads into the profound impact of omega-3s on neuroprotection and aging. I want to transition from managing our present mood to protecting our future identity.
The shield against time.
Exactly. Let's look at the data on neurodegeneration, Alzheimer's, and the literal shrinking of the human brain as we age.
Well, aging is fundamentally a process of accumulated cellular damage. And in the brain, the primary driver of that damage is oxidative stress.
Let's define oxidative stress biologically, because it gets thrown around a lot in, anti-aging circles.
Yeah.
What is actually oxidizing?
It is essentially biological rusting.
Rust.
Yeah. As your brain cells burn glucose and oxygen to create energy, which they do at a massive rate, they naturally produce byproducts called free radicals. These are unstable molecules that are missing an electron. Because they are unstable, they violently tear through the brain tissue, literally ripping electrons off of healthy cell membranes, proteins, and DNA just to stabilize themselves. This process is called lipid peroxidation, and it physically destroys the neural circuitry.
Wait, let me challenge this.
Sure.
If oxidative stress specifically attacks lipids And DHA is a highly complex polyunsaturated lipid with all those vulnerable double bonds we talked about.
Right.
Aren't we just packing the brain full of highly oxidizable material?
Yeah.
Isn't a brain full of DHA actually more vulnerable to rusting?
That is a brilliant biological paradox, and
Sure.
you are absolutely right. Polyunsaturated fats are incredibly prone to oxidation.
Right.
That is precisely why the brain has evolved an aggressively complex antioxidant defense system, utilizing compounds like vitamin E to constantly guard the DHA.
Wow.
But here is the mechanism. Omega-3s, particularly EPA, actually upregulate the body's internal antioxidant enzymes. They stimulate the genetic expression of the proteins that hunt down and neutralize those free radicals.
So they don't just sit there.
No, they don't just sit there waiting to be oxidized. They actively trigger the cellular defense systems.
So they arm the guards before the free radicals can breach the walls.
Exactly. And when that defense system fails, when oxidative stress and chronic inflammation run unchecked for decades, we see the hallmark neurodegeneration of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. We see the physical atrophy of the brain tissue.
Which makes the study from the University of Texas Health Science Center so compelling.
It's a huge study.
They didn't just look at elderly patients already suffering from severe dementia. They looked at middle-aged adults. And they didn't just give them cognitive tests. They mapped their physical brain structures.
They utilized volumetric MRI analysis. They were measuring the literal physical cubic volume of the brain tissue, and the findings were profound.
Here's where it gets really interesting for the listener.
Individuals with higher circulating levels of omega-3s possessed significantly larger brain volumes, specifically in the hippocampus, which is the epicenter for memory formation and the primary target of Alzheimer's disease.
Wait, really? How does a brain physically get larger? Are their skulls expanding?
Yeah.
I mean, what is actually taking up that extra physical space?
Well, it isn't that the brain is inflating like a balloon.
Right.
It is about the preservation of cortical thickness and gray matter density. A brain with lower volume isn't smaller because it was born that way. It is smaller because the neurons have literally withered and died off, leaving empty space or atrophied ventricles.
Wow.
The high omega-3 brains possessed larger volumes because they were successfully preventing that cellular death. They were maintaining the dense, highly branched neural forest that would otherwise be clear-cut by oxidative stress.
Your brain is literally larger and more robust when you have enough of these fats. And this introduces the concept of cognitive reserve, which the literature heavily emphasizes.
Cognitive reserve is the neurological equivalent of a massive savings account. As we age, a certain degree of neural atrophy is biologically inevitable. You are going to lose some brain tissue.
Sure.
If you enter your 70s with a depleted, structurally fragile brain, a small savings account, that inevitable loss pushes you immediately below the threshold of cognitive impairment. You instantly notice the memory loss because you have no backup circuitry.
But if you spend your middle-aged years building maximum brain volume, forging highly redundant, dense neural networks coded in DHA,
then you can afford to lose a substantial amount of tissue in your 80s and your cognitive processing won't even stutter.
because it reroutes.
The network simply reroutes the signal through the massive reserve circuitry you've built. The frontiers in aging and neuroscience data confirms this entirely. Higher omega-3 levels correlate directly with larger brain volumes and a vastly reduced risk of clinical cognitive decline.
Okay, the biological imperative here is undeniable. I mean, at this point, you listening are probably ready to go buy every supplement on the shelf or eat a truckload of plants.
Naturally.
But I need to step in and hit the brakes.
Right.
This is exactly where the deep dive has to pivot into the mechanical reality of human digestion and the supplement industry. Because the source material spends significant time dismantling highly pervasive and frankly dangerous myths about how we actually acquire these molecules.
Because the intention to build a healthy brain is meaningless if it doesn't align with our biological mechanics. We have to address bioavailability.
Let's tackle the most prominent myth head-on, the plant-based conversion trap. The assumption that you can achieve optimal neural architecture purely through plant sources, like flax seeds, chia seeds, and walnuts.
This raises an important question.
It does. Now, to be crystal clear to the listener, we are not litigating the ethical or environmental merits of a vegan diet. We are not taking a stance on that. We're simply imparting the content provided in the source material and looking strictly at the enzymatic pathways of lipid metabolism.
And those biological pathways are incredibly unforgiving. Plant sources are rich in ALA, the 18-carbon precursor we discussed earlier, but they contain 0 DHA and 0 EPA. For your brain to utilize the fat from a chia seed, your liver has to subject that ALA molecule to a complex series of enzymatic conversions, specifically utilizing an enzyme called delta-6 desaturase to physically lengthen the carbon chain and add the necessary double bonds to transform it into DHA.
And what is the efficiency rate of that enzymatic assembly line?
It is shockingly low. Depending on individual genetics, age, and concurrent dietary factors, the human body converts less than 5% and sometimes as low as 1% of dietary ALA into DHA.
Wait, 1 to 5%?
Yes.
If the conversion rate is that abysmal, how have entirely plant-based cultures or inland populations without access to marine life survived historically without suffering catastrophic population-wide cognitive failure? Does the body somehow adapt its conversion rate over generation?
It is a brilliant biological question, and the answer is rooted in genetics and historical context. There are specific genetic variations, particularly in the FADS gene cluster, that dictate how efficiently your liver produces that delta-6 desaturase enzyme. Certain populations with a long history of inland, plant-heavy diets actually evolved a genetic mutation that significantly upregulates that enzyme, allowing them to convert ALA to DHA much more efficiently than a population that evolved on a coastline eating fish.
So they adapted at the genetic level to compensate for the dietary lack of preformed DHA.
Exactly. However, for the vast majority of the modern population, that genetic upregulation doesn't exist. Furthermore, historical populations weren't battling the massive onslaught of modern oxidative stress, sleep deprivation, and systemic inflammation that aggressively depletes our DHA stores today.
Right. The environment is different.
The modern brain demands a vastly higher replacement rate of DHA than the historical brain. Relying on a 1 to 5% conversion rate in the modern environment is a physiological gamble that most people lose, resulting in a silent structural deficiency.
So what is the biological workaround for someone who strictly refuses to consume fish?
The source material offers a clear solution. It's to understand the food chain. Fish do not synthesize DHA and EPA magically within their tissues. They accumulate it. The actual primary producers of these highly complex polyunsaturated fats are marine microalgae.
Oh, algae.
The fish eat the algae, and the fats bioaccumulate in their tissue.
So the fish are just the biological middlemen.
Precisely. The clinical solution for a plant-based diet is an algae oil supplement. By consuming high-quality algae oil, you are bypassing the inefficient human conversion pathway, bypassing the fish, and delivering the exact preformed, highly bioavailable DHA and EPA straight into your bloodstream.
Which brings us directly to the second massive myth.
Yes.
The assumption that all omega-3 supplements are created equal. So what does this all mean for the listener standing in the vitamin aisle? If I walk into a pharmacy, I see an entire wall of yellow pills ranging from $5 to $50. What is the actual biological difference between a cheap, oxidized pill and a premium one?
The difference is often the difference between a potent anti-inflammatory and a highly toxic pro-inflammatory. There's a mental checklist you need. There are 3 critical data points you have to extract from the label.
Okay, let's break down the label reading process.
First, you have to ignore the front of the bottle entirely.
Ignore it completely.
A bottle might boldly claim 1,000 milligrams of fish oil, but fish oil is just the carrier liquid. You have to turn it over and look at the actual active yield of omega-3s. That 1,000 milligram pill might only contain 250 milligrams of actual omega-3, with the rest being useless filler fat.
Okay, so total active yield is step 1. Step 2.
Step 2 is the specific ratio. The label must explicitly delineate exactly how many milligrams are DHA and how many are EPA. If it just lists proprietary omega-3 blend without breaking down the specific structural and cooling molecules, you cannot trust the efficacy. You are flying blind biologically.
And the third point, which I found the most alarming in the clinical notes, is the potential for neurotoxicity regarding heavy metals.
This is the tragic reality of our polluted oceans. Because polyunsaturated fats bioaccumulate up the food chain, so do heavy metals like mercury, lead, and industrial PCBs. Large predatory fish, like tuna or swordfish, accumulate massive amounts of these toxins.
And mercury is highly neurotoxic. It actively destroys the very neural tissue we are trying to protect.
Exactly. Mercury actually binds to selenium in the brain, inhibiting the brain's ability to produce necessary antioxidant enzymes, leading to massive oxidative stress. Yes, If you bite into a fish oil capsule and it tastes profoundly rotten or excessively fishy, the delicate double bonds have already broken down. You are swallowing free radicals. You are actively inducing the inflammation you are trying to prevent.
This perfectly underscores the third myth, the trap of reductionism. The belief that you can just out-supplement a catastrophic diet. A pill is an isolation of a single compound. But human biology thrives on the complex, synergistic orchestra of entire food matrices.
Absolutely.
We have to build this into our daily mechanics. Let's transition into the actual action plan and the great omega balance, because this is where the biochemistry meets the dinner plate. Now that we know what to avoid and what's actually effective, how do we practically incorporate this into our daily lives without driving ourselves crazy?
Well, the foundation of the action plan for those who consume animal products remains fatty, cold water marine life.
Yeah.
Salmon, mackerel, sardines, trout, at least twice a week.
Why specifically cold water fish? Why doesn't a tropical fish have the same omega-3 profile?
It goes back to the physics of cell membranes we discussed in the very beginning. Remember how saturated fat freezes into a solid at room temperature?
Right, the butter analogy.
If a fish is swimming in near-freezing Arctic waters, its own cell membranes would freeze solid if they were made of saturated fat.
Oh.
To survive, cold water fish evolved to pack their cellular membranes with massive amounts of highly fluid, kinked, polyunsaturated omega-3s. Their biological necessity becomes our structural salvation.
That makes perfect sense. The environment dictates the lipid profile.
Yeah.
And you could also use plant sources for ALA, right? Like walnuts as a desk snack or flax and chia in smoothies or oatmeal.
Exactly. And look for fortified foods too. Eggs, milk, and bread fortified specifically with omega-3s, not just enriched with folic acid.
Now, the preparation of that fish, and oils in general, is deeply critical. The clinical notes insist on baking, broiling, or light grilling, never deep frying.
Because of the vulnerability to heat. We talked about lipid peroxidation occurring inside the brain via free radicals, but it also occurs in the frying pan via high heat. When you subject highly complex polyunsaturated fats to extreme cooking temperatures, the heat energy violently breaks those double bonds.
It destroys them.
It denatures the oil, turning a perfectly healthy structural fat into a highly oxidized toxic compound before it even hits your digestive tract.
Which is exactly why the notes give a massive warning about using delicate plant-based omega-3 oils like flaxseed or walnut oil. They are fantastic for cold dishes, drizzled over salad or cold vegetables. But the moment you put flaxseed oil in a hot skillet, you have destroyed its biochemical integrity.
Exactly. Cold use only. Don't cook with them.
Now, we arrive at what might be the single most important biochemical conflict in modern human nutrition.
The ratio.
Yes, the crucial balance. You can eat pristine wild-caught salmon 3 times a week. You can take a heavy metal-tested, molecularly distilled supplement. But if you ignore this next enzymatic reality, you are completely sabotaging the entire process. We have to talk about the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio and the absolute havoc of the Western diet.
This is the invisible war happening in the human liver. Omega-6 fatty acids are another class of polyunsaturated fats. Now, to be scientifically accurate, omega-6s are essential. Your body requires them to mount a proper acute immune response, like swelling that sprained ankle we talked about.
Right.
Evolutionarily, human beings functioned optimally on a dietary ratio of roughly 1:1, or perhaps up to 4:1, omega-6 to omega-3.
A balanced biological scale, equal parts pro-inflammatory capacity and anti-inflammatory capacity.
Yes, but the modern Western diet has violently shattered that scale. We are currently seeing population averages of 20:1, and in heavily processed diets, up to 50:1 in favor of omega-6.
How do we get to 50:1? What is the delivery mechanism for this massive influx of omega-6?
The industrialization of the food supply, specifically the invention and mass proliferation of industrial seed oils. Soybean oil, corn oil, cottonseed oil, safflower oil.
Seed oils.
These are highly processed, heavily oxidized omega-6 fats that are dirt cheap to produce and highly stable on a grocery store shelf. They are the primary ingredient in almost every packaged food, every commercial salad dressing, every baked good, and they are the default frying oil in virtually every restaurant. We are marinating our biology in them.
Let's break down the mechanics of why this massive imbalance is so destructive. Because it's not just that omega-6s cause inflammation independently, They actually actively block the omega-3s from working, don't they?
Yes, through a mechanism called competitive enzyme inhibition. Remember the delta-6 desaturase enzyme we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
The one the liver uses to process omega-3s?
Yeah, the conversion enzyme.
Well, the liver uses that exact same enzyme to process omega-6s into a highly inflammatory compound called arachidonic acid.
So it's a shared biological assembly line.
Precisely. And it is a zero-sum game. If you flood your bloodstream with 20 times more omega-6 from a plate of French fries fried in soybean oil, the omega-6 molecules completely monopolize the enzyme. The omega-3 from the salmon you ate earlier gets locked out of the assembly line. It cannot be converted, it cannot be utilized, and the entire system defaults to a state of chronic, systemic, arachidonic acid-driven inflammation.
Let me visualize this for you listening. It's like hiring a crew of elite carpenters, your omega-3s, to build the beautiful, intricate scaffolding of your house, your brain.
Right.
But simultaneously, you've hired a massive, chaotic demolition crew armed with sledgehammers, the excess omega-6s.
Oh, that's good.
You send them both to the same job site. Because there are 20 times more demolition workers. They take all the tools, they commandeer all the supplies, and they just start smashing the walls down. Taking an extra fish oil pill is just sending one more carpenter into a riot. You want to build a house, you have to physically fire the demolition crew first.
That analogy is biologically flawless. You cannot out-supplement a diet saturated in industrial seed oils. The clinical directive is to become a ruthless nutritional detective.
You have to read the labels.
You must read the ingredient lists on your oat milks, your crackers, your condiments. If soybean oil or corn oil is a primary ingredient, you are actively ingesting the demolition crew. You have to remove the inflammatory triggers to allow the omega-3s access to the enzymatic assembly line.
Empower yourself to be a nutritional detective. We have to clear the biological pathway. Okay, as we move into the final overarching segment of this deep dive, the clinical notes expand the lens significantly. Because eating the right structural fats and eliminating the inflammatory seed oils only provides the raw materials.
Right.
You can have a perfectly built, perfectly oiled engine, but if you leave it idling in the garage and never maintain the surrounding systems, it will still rot. We have to transition from the biochemical to the behavioral, the holistic brain.
The source notes provide 5 specific synergistic lifestyle protocols that act as the behavioral catalyst for the biochemical hardware we just built. And the most vital of these, the one with the most staggering clinical data, is physical exercise.
The source notes are blunt about this. They state that a sedentary lifestyle is the leading cause of all-cause mortality. Let that sink in. The simple act of sitting still is deteriorating our biology faster than almost any other variable.
It's true.
Why is physical movement so non-negotiable for the brain?
It comes down to hemodynamics and genetic signaling. We discussed how omega-3s build the membrane and reduce the inflammation, but how do those massive lipid molecules physically reach the hippocampus in the first place? They rely entirely on the vascular system. Exercise is the absolute mechanical pump.
Let's dig into that, because the recommendation is 30 minutes, 3 to 5 days a week. But what is actually happening inside the blood vessels of the brain during those 30 minutes?
When you elevate your heart rate, you create physical shear stress against the endothelial walls of your blood vessels. This mechanical friction triggers the release of nitric oxide, which is a powerful vasodilator.
Okay.
It forces the microcapillaries in your brain to dilate, massively increasing the perfusion of oxygen and lipid-rich blood deep into the neural tissue. But it goes beyond just delivery. Exercise is the primary trigger for the release of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
BDNF. I've heard this described as miracle grow for the brain.
It is the master protein that regulates neurogenesis. You can have all the DHA in the world floating in your bloodstream, but if your brain isn't producing BDNF, it won't trigger the stem cells to actually utilize that DHA to build new neurons.
So exercise is the trigger.
Exercise provides the BDNF signal that tells the brain we need to grow, and the omega-3s provide the bricks to actually do it. The source explicitly notes that across all clinical trials, exercise has the greatest, most profound impact on mental health and cognitive longevity.
Incredible. Habit number 2, engage in mental activities. Now, the notes are incredibly specific here. They state that keeping your brain active to build cognitive reserve does not mean just mindless phone scrolling.
Scrolling is biologically passive. It requires almost zero synaptic plasticity. To build the highly dense, redundant neural networks we discussed earlier, you must induce biological friction. You must force the brain into synaptogenesis, the mapping of entirely new connections.
I love this specific line from the clinical notes. Doing tasks that you don't like to do, that you find difficult, is actually really good for your brain. We naturally avoid intellectual discomfort.
We do.
But that feeling of mental strain, that deep frustration when you're trying to comprehend a complex mathematical concept or struggling to learn a new language or the chords on a guitar, that frustration is the literal physical sensation of your astrocytes and neurons forcibly mapping a new neural pathway.
It is exactly like muscular hypertrophy. A muscle only grows when you subject it to microtears through heavy resistance. The brain only builds new cognitive reserve when you subject it to the intense resistance of a novel, highly difficult task. If it isn't difficult, it isn't forcing adaptation.
Doing difficult things is a literal brain-building exercise. Habit number 3, manage stress. The source notes that chronic stress has a devastatingly negative impact on brain health. Let's look at the mechanism of cortisol, because it isn't just an emotional feeling of being overwhelmed, it is a physical neurotoxin over the long term.
When you experience acute stress, your amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, triggers the release of cortisol to prepare your body for fight or flight. In the short term, this is life-saving.
Right.
But when stress becomes chronic, when you are constantly bathed in cortisol from work anxiety, financial stress, or poor relationships, that cortisol begins to physically attack the hippocampus.
The exact area we are trying to protect with DHA.
Yes. Chronic cortisol literally causes the dendrites, the branching arms of the neurons, to retract and wither. It physically shrinks the memory center of the brain. The clinical advice here focuses heavily on timing. You need to learn to reduce stress when you feel it coming on, at the moment that you feel it the most.
Stop it in the moment. Don't wait until Sunday evening to try and decompress from a week of chronic cortisol exposure. The damage is already happening. You have to utilize mindfulness, breathwork, yoga, or meditation to interrupt the chemical cascade the exact moment the amygdala triggers it.
You have to forcefully shift the autonomic nervous system back into a parasympathetic state in real time. Interrupt the response before the cortisol can initiate the dendritic retraction.
Okay, habit number 4. This is structurally massive, and the source material gets highly prescriptive here. Quality sleep, 7 to 9 hours. We've established that omega-3s suppress the microglial fires during the day, and exercise pumps the nutrients in. But what happens to all the metabolic waste, the destroyed free radicals, and the dead cellular debris? If exercise is the pump, what is the drain?
Sleep is the drain. Specifically, a mechanism called the glymphatic system, which is only highly active during deep, slow-wave sleep.
How does sleep actually change the physical environment of the brain to allow this drain to work?
It is astonishing structural biology. When you enter deep sleep, the glial cells in your brain literally shrink in physical size by up to 60%.
60%.
This sudden contraction opens up wide channels between the neurons, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to rush through the brain tissue, powerfully washing out all the toxic byproducts, including amyloid beta plaques, which are the primary culprits in Alzheimer's disease.
Wow.
If you deprive yourself of deep sleep, the glial cells remain swollen, the drain stays plugged, and the toxic waste accumulates, causing massive cascading neuroinflammation.
To ensure that the drain opens, the notes provide 5 highly specific, actionable protocols to force the body into deep sleep. Let's break down the biology of why these work. Number 1, darken your room completely. Number 2, cool your room off.
The brain's circadian rhythm is heavily dictated by core body temperature. For the brain to initiate the transition into deep, slow-wave sleep, your core body temperature must drop by roughly 2 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit. A cool room facilitates this necessary thermal dump.
Which perfectly explains tip number 3. Do a TR, a temperature regulating, shower before bed. Now, taking a warm shower to cool down sounds paradoxical. Why does a warm shower drop your core temperature?
It is pure thermodynamics. When you stand in a warm shower, the heat causes massive vasodilation, the widening of the blood vessels in your skin, particularly in your hands and feet.
Okay.
This rushes blood away from your core and out to the surface of your skin. When you step out of the shower into your cool, darkened room, all that blood at the surface rapidly offloads its heat into the air, causing your core body temperature to plummet, which instantly signals the hypothalamus that it is time for deep sleep.
It's a biological hack to force the temperature drop. Tip number 4, do a breathing exercise in bed. Again, this is about forcibly down-regulating the sympathetic nervous system, telling the brain that there are no predators, that it is safe to shut down the sensory inputs.
Yes, shifting to the parasympathetic rest and digest state.
And finally, tip number 5, which is a stringent 2-part rule regarding electronics. Unplug your electronics 6 feet from your head and absolutely stay off your phone while in bed. We really need to unpack this 6 feet away rule.
The proximity rule is critical. We evolved to associate specific environments with specific biological states. The bed must be a sacred biological sanctuary associated exclusively with the neurological shutdown of sleep. The moment you bring a phone into bed, you are introducing intense blue light that halts melatonin production.
Right.
But more importantly, you are introducing the cognitive load of work emails, the dopamine spikes of social media, and the low-level pervasive anxiety of the outside world.
You are bringing the cortisol directly into the sanctuary. By keeping the devices 6 feet away, you create a physical and psychological boundary that protects the sleep architecture. And finally, habit number 5, socialize. Social interactions boost cognitive function and emotional well-being.
Human beings are profoundly social primates. The clinical data shows that social isolation is an aggressive, independent risk factor for rapid cognitive decline and all-cause mortality.
Why does talking to another human being protect the physical structure of the brain?
Because dynamic, meaningful human interaction is arguably the most complex cognitive task we perform. It requires the activation of the prefrontal cortex for working memory and emotional regulation. It requires the temporal lobe for language processing. It activates the mirror neuron system for empathy and reading microexpressions.
It's a full workout.
A deep, unstructured conversation is a full-spectrum, high-intensity workout for the entire neural network. It demands maximum synaptic plasticity, putting all of that DHA-rich hardware to immediate use. It is breathtaking how beautifully interconnected this entire biological system is. I mean, you prioritize the cold water fatty fish to acquire the highly flexible DHA, physically constructing the fluid cell membrane.
Right.
You relentlessly hunt down and eliminate the industrial seed oils, firing the omega-6 demolition crew to stop the internal inflammation. You utilize the EPA to generate resolvins, putting out the microglial fires that cause depression and anxiety.
It's all connected.
You engage in strenuous physical exercise to force the endothelial cells to dilate, pumping those lipid molecules deep into the brain while triggering the BDNF Miracle-Gro. You purposefully subject yourself to the friction of difficult learning to force the mapping of new synapses. You fiercely guard your sleep hygiene, utilizing temperature drops to shrink the glial cells and flush out the toxic metabolic waste. And you engage deeply with your community to flex the entire miraculous network.
It is a complete, holistic, and entirely integrated biomechanical system. We have covered an immense expanse of science today, from the molecular alphabet soup of ALA, EPA, and DHA, through the lifespan of brain development and mental health, to the actionable steps of eating fatty fish, avoiding seed oils, and optimizing sleep. You, listening right now, possess a profound, actionable understanding of exactly how much control you truly have over the physical architecture of your own mind.
And as we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you with a conceptual framework that builds upon every clinical data point we've discussed today. I want you to think about the concept of neurological retirement.
Neurological retirement.
Yes. In our modern society, we spend our entire adult lives meticulously planning for our financial retirement. We contribute to 401ks, we manage investment portfolios, we make difficult sacrifices in the present so that we can guarantee our security and independence in the future.
We build a financial safety net.
Exactly. But what is the utility of a massive financial portfolio if you lack the structural cognitive capacity to comprehend it, or the memory to enjoy the life it provides? What if we shifted our perspective and began viewing every serving of wild-caught salmon, every highly purified algae oil supplement, every grueling 30-minute workout, and every frustrating attempt to learn a new skill as a direct, non-refundable deposit into a neurological 401k?
Right.
The cognitive reserve we are actively building today, the dense, redundant, highly fluid neural networks we are forging right now, is the exact physical currency we will spend in our later decades to buy ourselves clarity, memory, and profound independence.
That is a phenomenal paradigm-shifting perspective. It completely reframes the daily friction of healthy choices. It isn't a chore. It is the most vital, high-yield investment you will ever make in your future self. Well, it's time to wrap up this deep dive. As you move through the rest of your day, as you audit the ingredients in your pantry or plan your wind-down routine tonight, remember that you are not a passive occupant inside your skull. You are the architect, the engineer, and the mechanic. We may never be able to pull back the curtain and take a perfect, high-resolution X-ray of our abstract thoughts or our fleeting moods, but we absolutely, unequivocally possess the scientific knowledge and the biological power to feed the machine, extinguish the inflammation, and physically construct a mind that is brilliantly, fiercely resilient. Thank you for diving deep with us today.